Hi everyone, my name is Ruth Shannon. I am going to talk to you today about punctuation. So this is the first of two presentations that I will do about punctuation. This one is specifically focused on commas. So the tricky thing about punctuation in English is that it is a mix of hard rules and stylistic choices. Especially for commas, most of the time it is not as simple as just saying use a comma here, don't use a comma there. So let's take a look at some comma usage in English and look at where this is a rule of you have to or cannot use it, and where it's an option depending on the effect you want on your reader. So here's the first sentence we'll look at. Please pause the video and decide if there are any errors in the sentence, and if so, correct them. Please note that some of these sentences may not have any errors in them. Okay, welcome back. So the issue that we're looking at in this first sentence is separating independent clauses. The sentence as written is incorrect because what we have here are two independent clauses, which means two clauses within the sentence that could grammatically be a sentence by themselves. We do not use a comma to separate two independent clauses. We can do one of two things. We can either put a period and make two sentences, or we can use a semicolon to separate the two independent clauses. This is a hard rule. It's called a comma splice when you separate two independent clauses with a comma. Make sure you do not do that. Choose one of these other options instead. Next sentence. Please once again pause the video, decide if there are any errors, and if so, correct them. The issue that we're looking at here is the introductory element. The introductory element is everything that comes before the subject in your sentence. In the example sentence here, the subject is its number of chromosomes. So the introductory element is when the cell divides. A comma is not necessarily required after an introductory element. The question you have to ask yourself is there any ambiguity about where my introductory element ends and the subject of my sentence begins? In this case, there is ambiguity, because if we read this sentence, we might read it as when the cell divides its number of chromosomes. And then by the time we get to our verb, is halved, we are a little bit confused and have to start the sentence over again so we understand what's happening. If we put a comma after the introductory element, it's much clearer. We understand that the main clause begins with its number of chromosomes, and then there's no ambiguity. If you have a very short introductory element, and there's no question about where your introductory element ends and your subject begins, then it's optional whether or not you use a comma there. In this example, there's no question about where the main clause begins, so it's up to you whether to use it or not. British English doesn't use very many introductory element commas. American English uses them most of the time. So it's a choice you can make. Just be consistent with your choice. Whether you decide to use them or not, just keep doing that. Okay, here's the next sentence. Pause the video, decide if there are any errors, and if so, correct them. So the issue we're looking at here is commas with coordinating conjunctions. In this sentence, your coordinating conjunction is but. It is perfectly fine to use a comma before the conjunction, but do not use a comma after. So in our example here, the first comma is correct, the second comma is incorrect. Coordinating conjunctions can be remembered using this acronym, FANBOYS. It stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And what it does in the sentence is, as it suggests, coordinates two elements of the sentence. So if the two elements you're coordinating are very short, for example, this sentence, little known yet deadly, it's optional whether or not you need a comma. It may not need it to be clear. If the elements you're coordinating are longer, then it might be needed to be clear in what you're saying. For the shorter sentences at the bottom, note that there's a difference in emphasis with these two sentences. So if you use the comma, it puts a lot of emphasis on the yet deadly. In the second one, there's no comma, less emphasis. It's more closely integrated into the sentence. So both are correct. Just depends on what the effect you want to have on your reader is. Next sentence. Please pause the video, decide if there are any errors, and correct them. Okay, so this sentence is actually correct as written. It may feel to you like it needs a comma in there somewhere because we have quite a long subject. Our subject is everything from the tetrahedral arrangement all the way up to atom. But we do not need a comma anywhere in this sentence. To add a comma between the subject and the verb, as in this example, would be incorrect. Even if the subject is very long and you feel like you need a pause, it's never correct to put a comma between your subject and verb. If you have extra information you want to insert into the sentence that would make the sentence too long or cumbersome, you can use paired commas, as in this example. Here we have some information that's between our subject and verb, but when we have it in the paired commas, in our minds, we sort of take it out of the main structure of the sentence, so it doesn't interrupt our subject-verb connection in the same way. Just make sure you don't use a single comma between your subject and verb. Next sentence, please pause the video, decide if there are any errors, and correct them if there are. Okay, so in this sentence, the comma is incorrect. And the reason is that we have here a defining relative clause. The relative clause is the part of the sentence that goes, "that laid the groundwork for her theory." And it is a defining relative clause because it's defining exactly which paper we're talking about. We're not talking about just any paper that she has written, we're specifically talking about the paper that laid the groundwork for her theory. So this is essential information, and we do not use a comma before the relative clause in this case. Defining relative clauses can use either that or which as the relative pronoun, but whichever pronoun you choose to use, do not use a comma in front of it. In this sentence, what we have is a non-defining relative clause. So it's still a relative clause, which laid the groundwork for her theory, but it's non-defining because it's not essential to understand the sentence. In this case, the important part of the sentence is her first paper was published in 1971. The clause, which laid the groundwork for her theory, is really just giving us extra information. The sentence still makes perfect sense without it. In this example as well, the important part is in 1971 she published her first paper. The clause is not defining, it's not telling us specifically which paper, it's just giving us some background information. So these here are hard rules. If you have a defining relative clause, whether you use that or which, do not use a comma in front of it. If you have a non-defining relative clause, which can only use which, do use a comma in front of it. Okay, so pause the video and once again decide if there are any errors, and if so, correct them. So here we're talking about the Oxford comma. The Oxford comma is a comma that comes before and or when you're making a list of things. The Oxford comma is commonly used in American English, less commonly used in British English. This sentence does not use an Oxford comma, and that's perfectly correct. This sentence is the same sentence but with the Oxford comma, also perfectly correct. Similarly to our discussion of the introductory element comma, it's a stylistic choice you can make, and the important thing is to be consistent. If you decide to use it, keep using it. If you decide not to use it, don't use it. However, if you have a long, complicated list with lots of embedded clauses, and those embedded clauses maybe contain the word and, then using the Oxford comma will make it much easier to understand. So in this example, the Oxford comma before and rebut and ultimately disprove allows us to figure out what are the elements in your list, what words in this sentence go together to make the items in your list. Otherwise, it takes quite a bit of time to figure it out. Okay, thank you very much for your time and your attention. I hope you feel more confident about using commas in English. I hope you understand where it's a hard rule of where you have to use it and where it's a choice that you can make. Join me again for punctuation part 2. Thank you, goodbye.